Lesson 71, Trinomials with Common Factors and Subscripted Variables. First, subscripted variables. When we've been doing our problems so far, we've mostly been using single letter variables like x and y. However, often in word problems, we'll want to use variables that indicate a little bit more clearly what it is that we're talking about. So, and for this, we'll often use subscripts. So for example, if we've got a problem about a certain number of dimes and a certain number of quarters, we could use these variables. Now if we want to use n for number, the problem is that that doesn't distinguish between dimes and quarters. So we might write n subscript d for number of dimes and n subscript q for number of quarters. And if we use these as our variables instead of single letters, it'll help us keep straight which one is our dimes and which one is our quarters. And we treat these just like any other variables, just keeping paying close attention that we write the correct subscript with the larger number. If we've got one about the sales on the first day of the week and the second day of the week, we might use variables with a subscript number. So we might have S subscript 1, sales on day 1, and S subscript 2, sales on day 2. Trinomials with common factors. We worked in the last lesson on factoring trinomials into binomials. Before we factor any trinomial, though, we should always make sure that we check to see if there are any common factors that we can take out before we do that. So for example, 4x cubed minus 4x squared minus 80x. Notice that each of those terms can be divided by 4x. So if we remove that first, it'll make our lives easier. In addition to that, we also can't apply our factoring methods from the last lesson to this trinomial, because notice the degree of this equation is 3. We have x cubed in there. And the methods that we used in the last lesson only apply for factoring trinomials that are quadratic trinomials, that is with a degree of 2. The highest exponent on a variable is 2. So if we remove this common factor of 4x from each of the terms, we divide that out of each of the terms and we end up with 4x times x squared minus x minus 20. Remember that the 4x stays in there. This is still part of this expression, but now we've divided it out from the rest of it. Now we're left with a quadratic trinomial that we can apply last lesson's factoring methods to. We need to find a number, two numbers which will multiply together to give us negative 20, and will add together to give us negative 1. The coefficient on that second term there is negative 1. And these will be positive 4 and negative 5. So this quadratic trinomial simplifies into the binomials x plus 4 and x minus 5, and then still times 4x there. Another place where we might want to make sure we factor out a common factor first is if we have a negative coefficient on that first term where the variable is squared. Really, we would like to keep these negatives out of the first term. So even though it might not look like there's a coefficient, remember the negative sign means times negative 1. So if we divide this whole equation by negative 1, we end up with negative 1 times x squared plus 2x minus 8. Remember, when we divide negative 1 out of this negative 2x, it'll become positive 2x. And when we divide negative 1 out of this positive 8, it'll become negative 8. So the signs will get flipped by that. And then we can apply our methods to this trinomial, x squared plus 2x minus 8. So finding two numbers that multiply together to give us negative 8 and add together to give us positive 2. Since they multiply to give us a negative, we know that one has to be positive and one has to be negative. And so we'll have positive 4 and negative 2 here, which will multiply together to give us negative 8 and add to give us positive 2. So our answer ends up being negative 1 times x plus 4 times x minus 2. Again, leaving that common factor there. It's still part of this expression. It's just that we removed it first before we factored out this trinomial.